So he says, this winter, I'm looking to add 2 to 3 days of strength and core training to my plan. Smart man, Cameron. He says, so now for my dilemma, I've considered dropping the volume back to a mid-volume plan or even a hybrid high-volume plan where I only do the Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday workouts when I add the extra load of strength training. But I've worked hard to make those big gains this year, and I'm worried that if I decrease my volume, that I'll lose some of those gains. On the other hand, I'm also worried that if I stick with high volume and add this additional training on top of that, I'll end up overdoing it and losing gains anyway. Super valid concerns, and really smart of him to think that he just can't do it all and be fine, right? Like, this stress is stress. So he says, I currently do my weekday workouts in the afternoon and weekend workouts in the morning. Is spacing the strength training workout several hours away from time on the bike enough? He says, I find that every time I think I know what I should do, I find a reason to rethink it. So as always, thanks for your help and guidance from Cameron. This is a great question, Chad. Tons
It's a
to
great
unpack.
question, man. There, exactly that. There are so many fun things to unpack. I think this question, more than any other in recent memory, I addressed every single point because they're all absolutely worthy of discussion and the research that went into some of them. So first off, Cameron, you've achieved the gains, and that's the hard part. So from this point forward, you could just go into maintenance mode, and maintenance is comparatively easy. So if you were just looking to hang on to what you are doing right now and supplement with some strength training, wouldn't be hard to do that because long-term adaptations have longer training residuals. We've talked about residuals before. We could put them in a different, you could call them quite simply residual adaptations. So once you've achieved the adaptation, how long does it reside if you neglect it? Long-term adaptations, longer training residuals, and long-term applies to the aerobic system because it trains up really slowly, but it also dissipates comparatively slowly, more slowly than, say, the anaerobic system, which trains up and declines comparatively quickly. You know, it doesn't go away overnight, but relative to the aerobic gains, it goes away more quickly. And you could think of this in a different context or different terminology and just compare basic abilities versus more specific abilities. So aerobic fitness and strength, basic. Anaerobic strength, alactic strength, all that, or power, very specific, depending on the type of racing you're doing. Second point, less volume does not have to mean less fitness. And this ties very much into what I just said. If you look at your residuals, or if you just look at a taper, you do far less volume, you maintain the same high intensity, and you have similar fitness throughout. Admittedly, you will lose a little fitness the longer the taper is, but that fitness is probably counterbalanced with the freshness that you reap from the taper. So it all kind of balances out. It usually favors the athlete if you do it right. So this is kind of this along the same lines, but tapers are drastic reductions. We dump off a whole lot of volume and keep the intensity, whereas you're talking about going from high volume to mid volume. That's very realistic. It's very reasonable too, considering you're going to add strength training and you're hanging on to so much of what's important. Touch on that in just a second. Yeah. So back to maintenance work, you can think of it on from another perspective, in that it is similar to the taper in that you're just touching systems up. And the aerobic system doesn't take much. I mean, every 10 to 14 days, do a long ride. That will touch up. It has been shown to touch up the aerobic system. Anaerobic system, have a weekly short hard efforts. Alactic system, do a weekly round of sprints. Doesn't have to be a lot either, but the point is, and then the same goes with strength, and we'll get to strength later too, but the point is you don't have to do much. You just kind of have to touch on those systems, remind them they're still relevant, your body still needs that from them, and then move on. In your case, Cameron, excuse me, you're keeping the meat of your loading weeks, and for that I applaud you. You're prioritizing and recognizing where the most value in the structure of each week lies. So even if you stick with a high volume, you're plucking out the most useful workouts in the high volume. Shifting to a mid volume, you're plucking out the most useful workouts in that mid volume plan. So my advice, aside from all this, or in addition to it, is it's far better to play this cautiously. And you can read that as intelligently and modify as you've proposed, because it sounds like a solid plan. But then at some point you're going to reassess, and then you'll make adjustments if necessary. I mean, it's just the gist of self-coaching.
One thing I would add to this too is that when you start strength training, right, Chad, there's an initial kind of, you need to allow for a good amount of stress to be added in. But then over time, just like you're saying with aerobic training and everything else, the maintenance doesn't take as much and it doesn't incur as much stress. So you'll likely be able to adjust things as it goes and maybe do more training on the bike once you get used to the load from strength
Very
training.
probably. Yeah. And I have a lot to suggest in that vein. So
Mm.
let me just say a couple things about strength work, because we covered this in pretty much in great depth last week, week before, whenever. First off, you're aiming your improvements at neuromuscular adaptations. So don't make these workouts metabolic. And that's an easy rut to fall into. Think of the fact that you're already addressing your energy systems, your aerobic, anaerobic, your oxidative, glycolytic. Let's probably should start shifting to those terms. They're a little more descriptive.
Mm.
And for clarification, if you are a CrossFitter or you think CrossFit is going to be what you're going to use to supplement your training, well, that's going to be your strength training. Anytime you hear CrossFit Metcon, metabolic conditioning, it's basically a VO2 max workout. So lump those onto everything you're already doing, clinging to the intensity that you've got during the week and the longer ride that you've got on the weekend. This will run you down fast. I don't think it'll take 2 weeks before you were dragging butt.
And one thing to think about that too is it's like it is stress on your system, but it won't necessarily, I know it won't give you the same performance boost as a TrainerRoad VO2 max, a cycling VO2 max workout. So think of, I know CrossFit bills themselves as the fittest people on earth, and you think you do Fran and you're gonna, it's very hard. It's separate. It's different, but it is stress you have to take into account.
Stress is the same system, but delivers very different performance benefits in the end. So that's the,
That's one way to look at it. Yes. Yep. Okay. So again, keep your strength work focused on neural adaptations. And yet another way to look at that is you can see the way that neural relates to hypertrophic gains. So the way that communication relates to the bigger muscle fiber gains is kind of similar to when we train the aerobic system and we get better mitochondrial function. Maybe not necessarily more mitochondria, no greater density, but the mitochondria work better. So in this case, the enhancements are in the function. They're not in the size of the muscle fiber or the quantity of the mitochondria. It's kind of along those lines. So you're training neuromuscular capacity. The aerobic capacity, the anaerobic capacity, leave that for the bike workouts. When you're in the gym, you're training your neuromuscular capacity. So again, function over energy system. I'm sorry, muscle function over energy system function. And yes, high force, low velocity. So heavy lifts is one way, but and I'll expand on this. The high velocity, low force is another way. So the power training, you don't necessarily have to lift heavy loads to get a lot of benefit out of time in the gym. Which brings me to the topic that I really want to steer this at, and that's concurrent training, because that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about stacking endurance workouts or really strength workouts on top of existing endurance workouts and figuring out how to make those things play nice together, trying to reap benefits from both without sacrificing, big gains in either. So concurrent training, doing both endurance training and strength training can be beneficial, but where most endurance athletes get it wrong, Nate kind of touched on this, is when you pile the strength work on top of your endurance training. You're already doing this much in a week. You decide you want to add strength training, so I'm just going to pile it on top. Why not? It's a different system. It's different stress. I can handle it. Probably not. Berryman, Mujica, and Bosquet, 3 names that are very notable in this, basically in exercise science, but also in the science of recovery and tapering and that sort of thing, did a review just last year, 2019. And they pointed to an old study by Hickson, it's decades old. It might be 1970, it might be 1980, that showed this similar strength gains in a group of people who concurrently trained, so did both endurance and strength, versus a group who just did resistance training. Similar strength gains until weeks 6 and 7, where the wheels started to come off the wagon. This is when the stress started to add up to a point where they're thinking, oh, I can do strength training in addition to my endurance training, and then found out, hard no, you cannot. You've only got so many resources. Then you look, flash forward a couple decades, 3 decades, whatever. Pavel Lanin in 1999 looked at elite cross country runners and saw improvements in their 5K times. And this is at the elite level via 9 weeks of plyometric and explosive training, what I just talked about earlier, which is the high velocity, low load. Anyway, so now they're moving quickly. Plyometrics, just body weight with a little bit of explosive weight training. So these are light loads. They're moving them quickly. How'd they do it? By replacing 32% of their normal running sessions. They took a third of their running off the table and replaced it with strength training. So, and they saw good benefit even at the elite level. Then finally, a 2005 study by Shitara, Shamari, and Schwachi. I talked about Schwachi last week or the week before when we covered strength training. And all these studies are linked, by the way. They used 48 recreational athletes to show that 12 weeks of endurance before strength training, and we're talking same day concurrent training. So same day, really relevant to all of us. They improved their 4K time trial times. They improved their time to exhaustion. They improved their max aerobic speed, and they did it better than the group who did strength before endurance. They did it better than the strength only. No surprise there. But big surprise, they did it better than the endurance only group. So for all the talk and the control. So for all the talk of focus on what you want to be best at, well, here's a little bit of evidence that says you can focus on something else and it will make you better in that thing that you want to be best at, even though it seems to fly counter to its adaptations.
But isn't in this study though, they didn't add like if they add the extra hour of strength training a couple days a week, they're not adding an extra hour of cycling. That's, you know what I mean? They're not controlling volume overall. So you do cyclists, you're doing 5 hours cycling or 5 hours cycling plus 3 hours of strength training. I want to see 8 hours of cycling versus 5 hours of cycling with, you know, 3 hours of weightlifting. That's the thing that people always say is like, well, it's, if I'm out of time, what do I do both? But I think I do it.
Sure,
And I think you do it. Everyone does it. Strength training is good.